In this chapter, I'm going to specifically walk you through how to find the main argument of chapter 1 showing up in grit. Now, the first thing I want to say is that there's more than one right way to state the main idea of a chapter. In fact, sometimes different arguments can be made for a different main idea being the key idea for a chapter. What's important is that when you're answering your reading questions, that you defend why you believe this should be the main idea of chapter 1, okay? And you do that by explaining your reasonings and then providing evidence from the chapter to show why you arrived at that conclusion that that is the main idea. So be aware that I will accept different answers from different people. Some people will arrive at different conclusions about what the main idea is, and that's okay. So just to give you a visual, because I know we're throwing around the terms argument and main idea a lot, there is the main idea and the argument of the entire book of Duckworth's books, Grit and the Power the Power of Passion and Perseverance. All right, so we would say that this is the main argument of the book, and it's like this: passion plus perseverance for the long term equals grit. That's Duckworth's main argument. What I'm asking you to do in the reading questions is find what is the main argument of the chapter. And as we go through the book each week, you're going to be doing the same thing for each chapter that we read. Okay. Now, underneath each chapter, you have evidence and support within each chapter that will help you find the main idea. And ideally, the goal is to be able to look at this chapter and realize how does it relate back to the main argument of the whole book. Okay, so there's a structure here. So the evidence of support is supporting the main argument of the chapter, and the chapters are supporting the main argument of the book. All right, you recognize this slide from the previous video. In this video, I'm going to focus on pointing out sentences to you that are at the beginning and end of the chapter that point toward the main argument of the chapter, and also when the author is describing her thought process. And then we're going to reflect on these final 3 questions. So it might help you to see this for now, but these are the questions I want us to ask, be able to answer by the end of this. What does Duckworth want me to learn from these individual stories? And I'll review them. And then how do we summarize all of these into the main idea for the chapter? And then how do they relate back to Duckworth's main argument for the book? So this is my version, my copy of Grit. And this is chapter 1. Now, while I do say a lot of times right at the very beginning of a chapter, Duckworth will give information. With this chapter, it's a little different in that she takes a little while to get to it because she's giving us a lot of background information with these West Point cadets. So for me, I don't really come across a statement that really says, this is what the point of this book and chapter is about, really till I get to page 7. And then I find my first clue with the sentence, those who dropped out of training rarely did so from lack of ability. Rather, what mattered, Mike said, was a never give up attitude. Okay, so that's right away. That should be cluing me into, grit. The title of her book's Grit. A never give up attitude sounds similar to grit. I also find we're stopped talking about West Point here, and now we're moving on to her own experience, and I'm getting a second clue. She said, I was interviewing leaders in business, art, athletics, journalism, and who are the people at the very top of their field? What are they like, and what makes them special? So this is an important question, and we're getting her own thoughts. She's relaying her thought process when thinking about grit. Okay, and then even a little further down, she's kind of pointing this out. Apparently, it is critically important and not at all easy to keep going after failure. So this seems like an important idea that stood out. Now on the next page, when we get to the bottom of that section, when talking about all these people in different areas, we get really where she almost gets the title for this book. She says it was this combination of passion and perseverance that made high achievers special. In a word, they had grit. So remember, that's the main idea that we said. Passion plus perseverance for the long term equals grit. All right, so we should be building an idea. Okay, there's something with grit and being an achiever and getting up after failure. And then we also get this statement where she says, so it's surprising really that talent is no guarantee of grit. In this book, we'll explore the reasons why. All right, so she's even relaying this now back to the whole picture of the book. And she wants us to realize that grit is something more than talent. She's distinguishing the two. So that might be even a key idea of this chapter.
Then if we go even further down, she gets away from West Point again, and she starts talking about sales a little further down. But right at the beginning of this section, and this is a clue, is look at the beginning of each section when she switches between stories, because oftentimes you'll get a little nugget of wisdom. So she's saying, does grit matter beyond West Point? So right here she's telling us, okay, what I'm talking about is going to apply not just at West Point, but in other people's lives and in other situations. And that's a key part of making a theory, is that it can be applied in multiple situations. So she says, I wanted to know whether it was just the rigors of Beast that demanded grit, or whether in general grit helped people stick to their commitments. Okay? So again, there's something about sticking with it and persevering. Now, if we go over to the next page where she's still kind of talking about sales, but she also gets into some other examples. She found that the salespeople, moreover, no other commonly measured personality trait, including extroversion, emotional stability, and conscientiousness, was as effective as grit in predicting job retention, right? So how many people stayed with their job sales? So there must be something about grit there. Then she talks about high school students. Students who graduated on schedule are grittier, and grit was more powerful predictor of graduation than how much students cared about school, how conscientious they were, and about their studies, or even how safe they felt. All right, so she's trying to point out that grit really is a lot more important than a lot of other things that we sometimes seem to think are really important. So that's kind of a key idea that she keeps coming back to. All right, even with graduation, she's pointing out that those who earned higher degrees tended to be more gritty. All right. When we get to the end of this section where she kind of talks about, sales and college degrees and everything, she has this final thought. So again, looking at the end of where these sections and stories are can help you realize what does she want us to learn from them. And this is what she says, but in each of these domains, when you compare people matched on these characteristics, grit still predicts success. So this seems to be a key idea that she keeps coming back to. Successful people are gritty. Grit leads to success. Grit keeps you from dropping out. Grit helps you push through failure. So maybe I would word my main idea or the main argument of this chapter is that grit is needed for success. That could be one way to word it, but there could be other ways. So then she goes on to the spelling bee, all right? And then define, all right, what can we learn from the spelling bee? We're going to go to the last page of the chapter. And she puts right up here, puts simply, grittier kids went further in competition. And then she also says, interestingly, I mean, we all expect that kids in, the spelling bee would be really smart with words and stuff. But she says there was no relationship at all between verbal IQ and grit. Okay, so again, there's this idea that it's not just talent, but that grit maybe helps talent, or grit is more important than talent. And then even at the very end of the chapter, we get a real key idea. She says, our potential is one thing, what we do with it is another. And that kind of reminds me of the title of the overall chapter, which is showing up, right? So think about in sports and stuff when we use that analogy, when we just say, hey, they showed up. They didn't just rely on their talent, but there's a benefit in just putting forth the effort. Okay, so those are my thoughts as I'm reading through the chapter, and hopefully they help you be able to formulate a main idea of what's important in this chapter.
All right, now that you've heard me give you my thoughts as I'm reading through chapter 1, it'll probably help you to go through these questions. So for the first is, what does Duckworth want you to learn from each of these stories? So we covered the West Point cadets, the successful people in sales, community college graduates, and then the spelling bee. So maybe just pause this video and take a minute to say, all right, here's the lesson I learned from each of these 4 stories. And then once you've done that, come back and then think about, how can you summarize all of these ideas? So all of the ideas that we've learned from these stories, how can you put them all into one idea? And we call this synthesis or synthesizing. How do you make multiple ideas and put them into one? And then after you've done that, think and ask yourself this question: does this idea support Duckworth's main argument, which is that passion and perseverance for the long term equal grit? So how does the main idea of the chapter that we were talking about right here. Whoops. How does the, sorry guys, how does the main idea of this chapter here relate to the book? And that's what I'm getting at with this third question, is you should be able to kind of explain, all right, everything that I said here does connect back to the main idea of the book for this reason. All right, if you have any additional questions or still feel confused, don't hesitate to give me a phone call and I'll be happy to sit down and talk with you and walk you through it.